Okay, I think we are now live streaming. So hopefully if everyone's here in the audience, you all are comfortable being live streamed on PRATT's YouTube channel. Um, and this is also being recorded as well. Live streaming. So hopefully if everyone's here in the audience, you all are comfortable. Okay, sorry, we're live streaming and double broadcasting my voice as it went out through YouTube. So I will let Dean Harris introduce this event, but we're really pleased to have everyone here. If you could all please keep your microphones muted, and if you have a question, you can put your name in the chat, and when it's time to answer questions, we'll call on you then. You don't have to put your whole question in the chat, you can just put your name. But if you can be muted while everyone's speaking, we'd appreciate that. Thanks.
Right, shall I jump in, Meredith?
Go for it.
Welcome, everyone. If you think you know my backdrop, feel free to answer in the chat. The quiz question for this evening and the bonus prize is extended love for recognising the contribution that women architects make to the field. And this evening, we're welcoming a number of women who are astonishingly talented, who are young architects and who are at the forefront of thinking and writing about how to remake practice. This is, in fact, the first of the PRATT architecture provocations for this year. However, this event is rescheduled because it was an early casualty of the COVID isolation that occurred from March onward earlier this year. And it's interesting to think about how the events of the summer have given us an even stronger mandate to host these kinds of dialogues and debate, and how incredibly avant-garde and pertinent they are. So they'll each present some of their work and their thoughts about practice, and then we'll have an open conversation. Welcome your contribution both through chat and an invitation to join in vocally with the Q&A. And they will also have as their compare for the evening Cynthia Davidson, who's an architecture editor and critic based in New York City and the respondent. She is also the founding editor of Log, which if you haven't read it, please subscribe, it's marvelous, which is a journal that's broadly, well, if you like, the subheading is Observations on Architecture in the Contemporary City, and highly regarded as a contributing member of the School of Architecture faculty. So welcome again, everyone. We're delighted you're all here, and just looking at the number of participants, it's exciting to see what will come next, particularly through the presentations and then later in the Q&A. So back to Meredith to introduce the speakers.
Great, thank you so much, Harriet. Yeah, I'm so pleased that we can do this event this fall. We are really excited to have these three brilliant young designers speaking with us and sharing not only the contributions that they made to Log 48, but also something about their own work and practice now that the sort of cycle of Log 48 events has happened. We really wanted to expand on that with sort of more thinking and more work from Bryony Roberts, Jess Myers, and Deborah Garcia. So I'll introduce them in the order in which I think they're going to speak. So Bryony Roberts co-edited this issue of Log, and she leads the design and research practice Bryony Roberts Studio, which integrates methods from architecture, art, and preservation to create community-based projects in the public realm. Her practice has been awarded the Architectural League Prize and the New Practices New York from the AIA New York, as well as support from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Graham Foundation, MacDowell, and the American Academy in Rome, where Roberts was awarded the Rome Prize in 2015. In tandem with her design practice, Roberts investigates research and publication projects about designing in response to social and cultural histories. She guest edited the recent volume, Log 48, Expanding Modes of Practice, which we're here to talk about, edited the book Tabula Plena, Forms of Urban Preservation, and co-guest edited Log 31, New Ancients. She's also published her research in the Harvard Design Magazine, Praxis, Future Anterior, and Architectural Record. She earned her BA at Yale and her MArch at Princeton, and she teaches currently at the GSAPP here in New York. Deborah Garcia is a Los Angeles-based designer, writer, and curator. She has a master's of architecture from Princeton and a bachelor's from the Southern California Institute of Architecture, otherwise known as SCIARC. She was a recipient of the Princeton University Butler Traveling Fellowship, which took her to the corporate agricultural complex of the United States heartland, where she was a resident at Art Farm, Nebraska, and was an invited participant for the 2019 Arctic Circle expedition in the international territory of Svalbard, Norway. She's co-curator of the drawing show at the A&D Architecture and Design Museum in 2017 and a curator of One Night Stand for Art and Architecture LA in 2016. She's currently the Marian Mahoney Emerging Practitioner Fellow at MIT's Department of Architecture. And I also had the honor of having her as a student once. Jess Myers is an urbanist, podcaster, and editor focusing on urban planning and architecture. Outside of her work as an assistant professor at the Rhode Island School of Design Architecture Department, she's the editor of Taking Freedom, a social justice book series forthcoming from a coalition of the Service Employees International Union, MIT's Community Innovators Lab, and the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies. She also serves as the chapter co-steward for the Architecture Lobby's New York chapter. In the past, Myers has worked in diverse roles as an archivist, translator, and analyst in both New York and Paris. Her personal interests and research engage multimedia platforms, and she has an amazing podcast as a means to explore culture and urban space. And I'm so pleased to welcome them here, and I'll turn it over to Bryony so that she can start us off tonight.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you to both Meredith and Harriet for making this event possible, and Federica. It's really a pleasure to be able to revisit this issue, and especially to see these contributors again, Jess and Deborah, who I haven't seen in a while. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. Let me know if you have any trouble seeing it. Oops. Okay. So I'll start off by talking just a little bit about where I'm coming from in my practice, and then I'll go into the details of this issue, Log 48, Expanding Modes of Practice. So the studio that I run, Bryony Roberts Studio, is a design and research practice based in New York City. And I'm also part of a feminist architecture collective called WIP Collaborative. And in my practice, the work that I do really spans a huge range of scales and mediums, but they're all sort of community-based projects in the public realm. And what connects all of these projects is an interest in how architecture is entangled in larger social and political conditions. And sort of to probe at that entanglement, I think requires expanding the processes of architectural design. So I intentionally sort of expand methods by drawing from adjacent fields that I think are often better at addressing social conditions, bringing in methods from performance, which can get to the specificity of bodies in space in particular places and times, social practice and community engagement, which can create platforms for people to voice their needs in the built environment, cultural heritage, which can uncover the overlooked social histories and offer methods for reviving these histories, and urban design, which can offer tools for addressing the scales of policy and planning to create a better public realm. And the goal of sort of tying these things together is really to be more specific. I think it's easy in architecture to get seduced by abstraction and the autonomy of creation only from the self rather than in response to the outside world. But I think that that's led architecture to complacency with systemic conditions of inequity and extraction in the built environment. So I think it's time to get more specific, to create projects that respond from specificities of existing conditions and lived experiences, and not just to accommodate them. So I'm interested in specificity on several layers. The site specificity of responding to existing buildings, as in this project, Soft Civic, and sort of really embracing the legacy of built architecture and all of the sort of material resources that it embodies, thinking through sustainability. But also looking at the specificity of the social histories of a place, the way that it has been occupied through time and how that's transforming in shifting urban conditions. And then the specificity of bodies in relation to materials. So I'm really interested in how to sort of address the experiences of people in a very concrete, tangible, and intimate way, to think about how materials can shape the body's sort of sensations, but also social interactions. So I sort of apply these methods in a multi-scalar way, thinking through, for example, with this project, with the WIP Collaborative. This was growing from research into designing for neurodiverse populations. And we were thinking through materials and colors and forms and how they could shape different pockets of experience, but then kind of zooming outward, imagining that shaping a public realm and connecting to existing infrastructures and institutions through programming and collaborations. So in addition to this practice, oops, why is it not letting me there? As Meredith mentioned, I also do teaching and writing and editing, and had the pleasure to edit this recent issue of Log at the invitation of Cynthia Davidson. And I'm very grateful for her patience and generosity through that whole process. So the project took shape over the course of 2019, really kind of reflecting back on the activist movements that had been growing in the previous years and how they were impacting architecture, with particular attention to the relevance of feminist and anti-racist work. But then at the time, you know, those were still relatively fringe topics, I think, within architecture. But then just as the issue was supposed to be released, all of the sort of craziness of 2020 happened. With the pandemic and the widespread protests against racial injustice, it really brought social justice issues to national attention. And in the time since, I think the country has had to confront the visceral realities of social inequity, the vast disparities in healthcare, in job security, in policing, in housing, in childcare. These issues have all been laid bare in 2020, and it's impossible not to address them. But it's also outside of the conventional skill set of architects to do so. Generally speaking, architects are not taught to actually work with people, to talk to them, to understand their full everyday lives, and to register their experiences in the process of design, let alone to tackle systemic issues of inequity. So to do so would require radical rethinking of both bodies of knowledge and methods of practice in architecture. And that's really the challenge that this issue of Log addressed. In particular, it's learning from lineages of critical race theory, of intersectional feminism, and radical care to propose alternative ways of knowing and practicing in architecture. So the term intersectionality has become very prevalent in recent months, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but in case not, it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, but it really grew out of decades of multiracial feminist activism. And it's the idea that a person's experiences are shaped by intersecting conditions, so such as those of gender, sexuality, ability, citizenship, class, race, but also age, language, and many others. And to only address one form of oppression, such as sexism, would be to overlook the ways in which, for example, sexism and racism are compounded in an individual's experience. So this points at how entrenched systemic issues play out in the personal experiences of individuals situated in particular places in time, how people experience systemic problems by the way they move through the world, the way they are spoken to, looked at, and touched. So intersectionality, as well as the related work on standpoint theory and situated knowledge, offers a way of seeing social justice issues as both personal and systemic simultaneously. And it begs action at both interpersonal and systemic scales. So the mixing of the personal and the systemic, the specific and the abstract, the messy and the categorical intentionally breaks down hierarchies embedded in established theories and practice, making room for individual experiences overlooked by institutions and canons. Complementing these perspectives, radical care pursues multiple levels of care simultaneously, from the self to the community to global networks of human and non-humans, in order to counteract exploitation and extraction. Together, these approaches constitute rejections of patriarchal colonial systems and instead posit ways of building care networks through interpersonal and systemic support. So this issue really asked how all of these perspectives relate to architecture and how they can prompt new ways of working. Through this incredible lineup of contributors who I was really blessed to work with, we were sort of asking both what are the implications for theory and for the very concrete mechanics of practice. So there were contributors who were really addressing this question of knowledge in architecture. What are the bodies of knowledge that we draw from? Such as Mabel Wilson, who in her interview really calls for decolonizing architectural knowledge. She points to the ways in which histories of Western imperialism were tied to the kind of bolstering of Western architectural institutions, and instead asks how we can think beyond the conventions of drawing, archives that have come from those traditions. We also have Deborah Garcia, who's here today, who's questioning the conventions of mentorship and authority in architecture, pointing out how patriarchal those histories are, and instead asking how we can create different kinds of networks of support. And transitioning into practice, Jia Gu is talking about formats of care. So really thinking about the implications of radical care for practice. And thinking through the kind of interconnected methods of curation, of design, and activism. And Jess Myers, who's here tonight, writing about kinship and really talking about the importance of understanding kinship between human and non-human communities, and sort of questioning the ways in which we value architectural contributions. So the issue also looks at specific practices and really looks under the hood to ask them how they organize themselves, how they structure their offices, their finances, their community partnerships, their design processes, with the belief that it's actually in those details in which you can kind of restructure the values of practice. So one of the interviews is with Assemble in London, which is a cooperative kind of flat hierarchy practice. And they're also part of building forms of cooperative land ownership within London, such as the Granby Four Streets projects, and work with residents to also rehabilitate the existing buildings. Another interview is with Hector, based in Newark, New Jersey. And one of their contributions is really developing creative methods of co-creation, of designing with communities through processes of making. So for example, creating these collages in which community members are expressing what they want out of a public space, or these large scale collaborative models. And those feed directly into their designs for public spaces. And lastly, LA Moss in Los Angeles, which like Hector is a combination of sort of architects and urban designers. They really kind of look at policy and hack the existing systems, in this case, looking at the capacity for accessory dwelling units in Los Angeles in order to create affordable Section 8 housing within residential neighborhoods. And they designed and built a prototype that then could be reproduced. So together, I think this roster really exemplifies very exciting new directions for architecture. And I think they kind of counteract a lot of the skepticism that's often addressed towards socially driven practices. You know, accusations that the work is ugly because it's designed by committee, or that it's not viable as business models. And I think it's incredible to see the sort of growth of practices that not only have really fierce and incredible design sensibilities, but also are managing to build these self-sustaining practices, often through kind of cooperative models or through interdisciplinary collaborations. And that really echoes sort of the point that I started with, that a lot of these are made up of collaborations between architects, urban designers, and outside collaborations with activists. And they're sort of expanding the toolkit of architecture in order to really be able to more nimbly address social issues at this moment. So now I'm going to hand it over to two of our contributors, to Jess Myers and Deborah Garcia, to talk about their work. Thank you.
Okay, Jess, did we have an order? Okay. All right. So I guess I'll just jump in. Just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. It's really awesome to be able to be here and to talk a little bit about the issue and my work overall. I think maybe I'll start with I have a presentation, so I'll just screen share and get started.
Actually, Jess, if you don't mind taking over, this wouldn't be a good presentation without some technical difficulties.
Yeah, no problem. I can do it first. I will also screen share. I feel I always get very directed when I start to work on a presentation. And also I'm constantly accused of not talking about my own work, which I will not be doing tonight either. I'm going to talk a little bit through the essay and sort of how the last few months have really helped me take a different perspective on it. So I will share. All right. So as mentioned, I am an assistant professor at RISD. I also edit a book series called Taking Freedom, and I'm in the process of working on the third season of my podcast, Here There Be Dragons, which tracks through different cities, talking to residents about their experiences with fear, security, and identity. And the latest season will be about Stockholm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this piece for Log, and I think I speak for many editors who occasionally write when I say that it's a particular kind of pain to return to a piece once it's published and ostensibly finished. And I say this as someone who can barely read an essay without redlining it, and also as a person who is constantly seeking greater precision and clarity in my own position. And if there's anything that living alone in a lockdown can provide, it is greater clarity and precision. When this piece, Kinship, was first published, the lockdown was just beginning. And after all that's happened, I found that there were some concepts that I wanted to return to and expand on. So I think I will indulge my editor's self and do a little redlining. This piece was first inspired by some comments made by Dr. Kyle White, made at a conference at the center, the Canadian Center for Architecture. He said, "There's always so much urgency around climate change, but almost none around the death of kinship. When you break treaties, renege on agreements, and disregard sovereignty almost as a rule, you'll find it difficult to get anyone to move towards the same solutions." This comment was almost a throwaway remark, but to me, it snapped together some core stakes of many issues in my mind, and also many references that I had thought unrelated. In the academy and in practice, we are so dedicated to the divisions of discipline and their isolated areas of associated expertise that we, and I include myself in this, forget that we made up these divisions for the sake of ease or intellectual territory or liability or branding. And often the issues at hand have very little to do with these distinctions. But we ourselves are so dedicated to them that it becomes easy to imagine that climate change is a concern belonging exclusively to the scientific or the technocratic. We dismiss kinship right out of the conversation. But Kim Tallbear expansively defines the term when she says, "It is learning how to live here in relation with this place and with peoples who were long co-constituted in relation to these lands and waters and skies. And this is not a moralistic sense of obligation, but it has been created through the steady work of kin making in order to live. We need kin to survive."
Yes.
Jess, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think we can't see your slides. They're like,
Oh, let me try to do the thing where you stop sharing and share again.
oh yeah, we got him.
Okay, if I go up,
Yep, that
can
works.
you see?
Yeah.
It works. Okay, perfect. So let me just repeat that quote one more time because it is important to the rest. Okay, so she says that learning to live here in relation with this place and with peoples who were long co-constituted in relation to these lands and waters and skies. And this is not a moralistic sense of obligation, but it has been crafted through the steady work of kin making in order to live. We need kin to survive. Can you see that? Great. She brings kinship out of exile and into the very center of the issue. It goes beyond, can we cobble together enough solar panels and high performance curtain walls to live our exact same lives, and into how do we reconstitute social relations to achieve collective survival. But what does this have to do with architecture? I'm very glad you asked. I see centering kinship framework as a means to move beyond the idea that in architecture, our products are the best and only solutions. It allows us to reframe what exactly our agency is. We, as organizers of the built environment, have the unique ability to make prevailing systems of power concrete. It is visible in the clients we privilege, the projects we clamor for, the education we provide, and the conventions we do not question. It is there. So is there a way that in this great power that we hold, we can enshrine a more relational, more kin-centered model? If this moment has made anything more precise or more clear, it is that this is a time to move forward on demands that were previously thought unimaginable. This is not a time for obfuscation or double talk. The call to action has been abolition, not reform, land back, not decolonization. Yet architecture remains incremental in a time where the increment is no longer the measure. If we make kinship the framework through which we construct our demands, what is the great transformation we would call for? And what would we sacrifice to get it? In March, as practices came to terms with working from home, it became clear that greater flexibility is possible for workers. In June, as many in the sector offered tempered support for the Black Lives Matter movement, the bar for concrete acknowledgement and accountability grew higher. In September, schools opened, leaving students in uncertain limbo, but very certain debt. As we are pushed to return to work, to head to the polls, to pay our loans, and myriads of other pressures, what new collectives might form? What will the nature of their demands be? And how could this change be what we consider architectural work? These questions returned me to Gregory Bateson's critique of the popular understanding of evolution, which I know sounds like a record scratch, but please, as I am always asking my students, just go with me on this one. Here, Bateson says, the unit of survival is not the breeding organism. The unit of survival is a flexible organism in its environment. The demands for unionization, for the end of private property on stolen land, for the complete transformation of institutions are forms of survival that require strategies that move beyond the struggle to continue as is. That is the struggle of the organism only concerned with breeding. The flexible organism in the flexible environment can move through and respond to transformation as a matter of course. This expansion of kin, this movement of collective, is the work of the survival, and it could also be architectural work. I want to end on something that I say to my students constantly, but I have borrowed it from poets and from theorists and from organizers. Kinship framing gives us architects the gateway to demand larger and more transformational asks. The purpose of such a demand isn't that you immediately get everything you want. Rather, it creates the horizon line, a direction towards which you can walk, towards which others have walked before you, and still more will walk after. When you create that direction, will you come with me becomes a very reasonable demand. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jess and Bryony. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Hopefully this time will be fine. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into a bit of the description of the writing that I did for log 48, which I'm gonna assume that you read the entirety of the volume from start to finish. And I'll talk a little bit about it at the beginning, jump into some of my own work and maybe a bit of a kind of more literal conversation of this word practice, and then end on a kind of return to the writing in a kind of final project that I'll show. So the piece is called Call Me Daddy. I think that there's a couple sort of interpretations or things that are put on the table immediately with the title and maybe the literal ask of the piece. I think that we'll sort of dive into a little bit of the conversation more about what I mean by the word daddy, but going back to Bryony's great description of the piece, I think that it is in a large part questioning this concept of lineage in architecture. And I'll go through maybe just a couple of the diagrams that I show in the writing to maybe set the table for what would be essentially, I think, really an argument that prefaces or maybe tries to sort of argue that architecture has so long been about a kind of, I would say, a myth making or a storytelling of architecture as, or the ability to do architecture or make architecture in the world as a passed down or inherited power. And so in that sense, maybe this is about fathers or father figures in architecture, but it's also not. I think I'm more interested in this idea of authority and the exchange of authority and what an exchange of power would mean in architecture versus lineage and inheritance, which in fact have no fluidity of power and are sort of one-to-one diagrams. So in thinking about what those diagrams are, the piece kind of immediately puts on the table, and the piece is me. I immediately put on the table maybe one of the architectural diagrams that we've all seen about 1 million times. And I don't know if I would call this an architectural diagram per se, but in many ways, I think this is, Charles Jenks's diagram that I like to call the kind of cafeteria diagram. It's a sort of stance on what would be a kind of evolution of architecture, but it doesn't really do that. I think that to really look at this diagram would be to think about how people are organized, people being that architecture is exercised by people, and that in a lot of ways, the sort of practice of architecture has long since been one in which you would interpret practice as office or practice as specifically the practice of one person or a couple people operating together to make or do architecture in the world. And so to me, this diagram, I think, is less interesting as a history of architecture and way more interesting as a sort of gossip column. And in the sort of gossips and dramas of architecture, what we uncover is an incredibly boring and not so dramatic story of architecture, which is one of the power to do architecture being passed down to a limited, or we could say a sort of strategically built group of people. You know, I think that also maybe, you know, takes us into questions of architectural education and where that takes place, who gets to have an architectural education, who gets to enter the stage, which I think is also a kind of really important part of this conversation. But I think in sort of, again, the kind of cafeteria table, who's cool, who's not, who's hanging out with who, reading of this, it seems immediately interesting when in fact it's not. And maybe to sort of kind of make that a little bit more clear, in sort of as a companion to the famous Charles Jenks diagram is this diagram from Roxanne Williamson's American Architects and the Mechanics of Fame from 1991. And so I've seen this diagram kind of circulating a little bit on Instagram in maybe the last couple of months. And it's been really interesting to see how, to me, this diagram is a pairing to Charles Jenks's diagram in the sense that it takes away the fun squiggles, like it takes away the figures, it takes away the sort of built diagrammatic play, and literally tries to give you the most kind of straightforward and yet sort of very revealing lineage of how architecture is done, right? And so this diagram sort of charts employer to employee relationships, meaning it strips away the idea of architecture as a kind of we could say an evolutionary, meaning an evolutionary and individually originating aesthetically driven in certain cases project, and rather is one that's incredibly straightforward and really kind of at face value, right? If you worked for someone, you sort of took on some of their stuff, some of their baggage. And I think that immediately when we start to investigate this diagram, the question that I sort of immediately would ask, and that's kind of obvious, is where are the women in this diagram? And in the entirety of Roxanne Williamson's book, there's a mention of 3 women in the book, including Denise Scott Brown, who's shown in the bracket or dash connection to Venturi, which would be, if we go back to our first diagram, is a line, an annotation indicating partnership or close association. And so I think that in this conversation of a kind of lineage of architecture, there's already a lot of messiness in that we don't know, that is not told in architectural history, that we all sort of take on its modalities and its decorum and its kind of unspoken rules. And yet within that, there's already things that are not being fully divulged or not explored fully, right? If this is an employer-employee or a kind of mentor-mentee diagram, there's still things that are sort of being omitted, or even I would say kind of reduced to even less than they truly are, right? The sort of dashed line versus the hard line already being a kind of questionable diagrammatic and sort of narrative tool. So the piece maybe jumps from this kind of idea of lineage to then what does it mean to consider the kind of father figures of architecture, which again, father figure meaning to me not literally your father, but the authority figure of a narrative, right? And so, or a relationship. To me, the word daddy, and I dive into this a little bit more, but the sort of question, the idea of daddy and its sort of terminology in gay culture and in the culture of, we could say, consensual sort of flipping of power structures, be that you know, in sort of architecture or not. That father figure has nothing to do with literally being a father or inheritance, but rather the kind of utilizing of an authority or a kind of power that is sort of passed down in architecture. So this image, I mean, to me is very, to me, I mean, this is like my lineage, right? I graduated from SciArc. I think that this image to all SciArc students is something that we encounter kind of immediately in our education, meaning it's the history of the school, and the history of the school comes from this sort of story of like these rebellious, you know, architects who say, you know, you've got your school, we're going to make our own. We have our own way of teaching architecture. We have our own idea of what architecture should be. And so start SciArc. And so this image is a group of some of these guys are founding, you know, father figures of architecture. Some of them are not, but ultimately kind of make up what would be the equivalent of a kind of, you know, early sort of boy band. Like these were the originators of like the punk rock garage scene in Venice, or and I think immediately sort of sets the stage for what that means, right? For what is a kind of carefully constructed image of what it means to be a sort of not only a founding figure, but a figure of authority in architecture. And so while this image has maybe specific kind of importance to architectural education, especially on the West Coast, by itself as a kind of standalone image, I think it's a really interesting image to sort of think about in those terms. So maybe moving into my own work, which I'll sort of have to kind of flip through since I don't want to take up too much time. I think that in those terms of architecture as, or in questioning the idea that architecture is handed down, or that the ability to do architecture or to make architecture is necessarily handed down or transferred in its sort of typical narratives, I think then comes the question of how do you do architecture otherwise, or what are other ways of doing architecture? And I think that all of Log 48 in a way is a response to that, or is it presents alternative modes of doing architecture that sometimes I would say challenge a particular, very particular and specific history of architecture. For me, also, the word practice means literally, I think, practice in terms of practice makes perfect, or the idea of doing something until you kind of figure out how to do that thing. And maybe in that sense speaks to a less kind of, not only an architectural way of sort of operating in the world. So Stranger in a Strange Land would be how I view myself in a lot of the ways that I try to jump into architecture, meaning architecture as a way of seeing the world and of investigating the world. And to me, that means, because as architects, what we do is we sort of look at the world and I think try to respond to it, and maybe like attempt to do something in it, and attempt to influence, be it the built environment or the environment overall. And so to me, maybe the question is, along with doing architecture and like looking at the world, would be the question of where do we go and what do we look at? And who are we when we do those things? And so I'm going to show a couple just short clips of the work that I've done in the last 2 years. Part of that is research in the Arctic Circle, and then research in Texas this last year. Going to landscapes that are like, to present to me strange lands. I'm a kid from East LA, sort of, finding myself in these places. So there's a kind of personal part to this practice. I'll just show a bit of this and then just jump to the end. It'll be video, so adjust your audio at your own risk. So the images that you just saw are from a couple locations in the Arctic Circle. The first is the territory and the island of Pyramiden, which was the bird-infested building, which is essentially on what would be kind of Soviet territory in the Arctic Circle. And then a sort of series of exercises that were done collaboratively with a couple different artists and scientists that were also collaborators in this Arctic Circle expedition. And then the final kind of video is me sort of spending less time in the environment and in our sailing vessel itself and sort of digging into its storage, which led to a final project that then continued in Texas with my students at TTU. I'll sort of jump from there maybe into the last slides. So going to the Arctic Circle, I think this sort of exploration of a territory that I had no understanding of is in many ways a kind of parallel to my time spent at Texas Tech University last year as doing research and teaching. Another kind of landscape that I didn't know very much about. And in both places, practicing seeing in a collaborative manner. In the Arctic Circle, it being a sort of gathering of research, and in a sort of tiny video that I showed there, we were measuring and listening to icebergs with a couple of participants. The residency isn't collaborative, that it was a sort of moment of collaboration coming out of a mutual crisis of not knowing what to do in this place. And then thinking about those modes of practice that begin to, I think, have a larger idea of what it means to collaborate with each other and sort of move beyond a single project. And I think those things to me are really interesting. And so to maybe go back to the idea of stranger in a strange land, or my own interpretation of what that word means and what that means for a kind of practice of architecture. To me, the practice of architecture is really a practice of seeing the world in a way that's attuned to the built environment and to our relationship to the built environment. And so be that the Arctic Circle or be that Texas, I think there are certain things that began to sort of stand out to me in the last year, and maybe led up to this piece of writing, which was done in a kind of crisis, right? Coming from the Arctic Circle, which was melting, is literally in a kind of crisis. Then going to Texas, which to me was a sort of presented its own sort of environmental challenges and sort of interesting things to look at. I think ultimately being there and with a lot of conversations with Dora Epstein-Jones, who was also a big part of the influence on the Call Me Daddy writing, I think I ultimately I think diving into crisis became a part of thinking about what the practice of architecture is. And sort of thinking about what crisis does and what it means to encounter the crises of architecture. And so I think I'll end it on this statement, which I sort of reference a little bit in the writing, but this was Toshiko Mori at the AIA conference in 2019, I think responding to crisis very literally in a way that I think was really productive. And so I think that there's a sort of coupling to me of practice with also a sort of awareness of where we go and what we look at, that discomfort is sometimes a part of that, or the discomfort for me has been a big part of the way that I look at the world and the way that I practice, I would say, kind of research or a kind of way of looking at the world, which I think is architectural in many ways. So I'll sort of end it there and open it up to everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you all. That was incredible. And now Cynthia Davidson, our moderator, will take over. Cynthia, I think you're muted.
You're right. I was trying to be a very, very quiet observer. So you wouldn't hear my pen scratching furiously as these people talked. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Meredith, for reviving this. Thank you, Federica. It's true that as Bryony laid out, that we did a lot of work on this issue in 2019. And by the time it came out in 2020, there was this chance that it could get lost in the pandemic and all of the crises that it has brought to the fore. But in fact, the issue has done extremely well, and in many ways seemed to be very timely, as Bryony said, with many of the issues that arose about architecture and practice. In the spring, the Architecture League had Bryony moderate several panels with architects who are not in the issue, whose practice might be considered more alternative or a broader form of practice, an expanded mode of practice. So there seems to, we seem to have kicked up a lot of dust, shall we say. I wanted to start by first referring to the diagrams that Deborah just reminded us of, both the Jenks diagram of movements in architecture and the Roxanne Williamson diagram that she showed and that is published along with her article. One of the reasons that Bryony and I started talking about this issue, maybe even as long ago as the end of 2018, is that I believe that diagrams like Charles's and like Roxanne's don't include women because women have not been doing the writing of the history of architecture. Women have not historically been drawing the diagrams as to what's been happening in architecture. And as someone who's been editing an architecture magazine since 1983, go ahead, figure out how long ago that is. And I think about the people who have written for me over these decades. Only really recently have more women been writing about what practice is, what theory in practice is. And I'm talking about outside of purely academic process or practice, but something that's more involved in actually practicing architecture and figuring out what that means. And I think that where Bryony and I began our conversations was my concern to have an issue that was mostly focused on women's contributions, not exclusively, but largely focused on women's contributions. And through Bryony's work on this idea, she developed this whole idea of expanding modes of practice, which I'm really thrilled that we have produced because it's not only bringing many more women writers to the fore, but they're supporting new ideas about how we might consider practicing architecture. And so these diagrams that Deborah shows today, I would anticipate should be starting to be changed fairly soon, Deborah. By the time you write this article again, it might be hello mommy and not goodbye daddy or whatever, right? We'll see what happens. So we're here tonight to ask Bryony and Deborah and Jess questions. And as Meredith said to you at the beginning of this, if you have a question or you want to ask a question, I can't see you, so I can't see you raise your hand, those of you in the audience. So you should just write in the chat, I have a question, with your name so that I can then ask you to turn on your microphone, if not your camera, and ask your question to the speaker directly. But I thought I wanted to start by addressing a question to Jess myself, because I really related to what you said, Jess, when you said that as an editor and a writer, you can't read anything without wanting to redline it. I mean, this has been the bane of my existence as an editor as well. And so I wanted to ask you, when you reread your piece prior to tonight's presentation, what did it make you want to do? Did it make you want to create something more manifesto-like? Did it make you think you hadn't done enough of a manifesto? Because when I was listening to you, I felt that you're on the verge of a manifesto tonight that isn't really in your piece. And I wonder if there was some kind of relationship there.
Sure. I mean, this is the excruciating aspect of reading a piece that is, that you can't mess with anymore. And it's funny because a while ago in the before time, I was at a lecture that the bassist, the jazz musician Esperanza Spalding was giving. And one of the things she said was that she hates being tied to something that she did or said, like even like 10 minutes ago. And, this is a woman who comes out with like a chamber music album, a jazz album, a rock album, album back to back to back to back. And something that I find frustrating about writing and actually really a huge relief about editing is that editing is this practice of sort of peeling things apart and like repiecing them and knitting them together in a more precise and clarifying way. And so when I return to my old essays, even things that I was satisfied with at the time or even am satisfied with now, I'm just like, oh, I have been, I've had a conversation that really changed the perspective that I would take on that now, or I read something or I heard something or I watched something that could have made this like something more, something different, And it's not to say that I don't think that the piece is good or that, I'm not proud of it or anything like that. It's just that, I have this constant sort of gnawing thing of dissatisfaction when it comes to, I just want to keep pushing or making more precise or making more clear. And I think that I'm going to, be quite nerdy here and say that there's a passage in the Phaedrus, I think, where Socrates says that the problem with literacy, not to say that I am promoting illiteracy, but he says that the problem with literacy is basically that when you ask a book a question, it can just tell you the same answer, right? And you can't really see, where the author has gone since that text, and that the real way to churn through argument or concept or idea is in conversation, which is why he's sort of, he is making this statement at a time when like ancient Greece is like moving from an oral tradition into a written tradition, which had to be very jarring at the time, maybe as jarring as the internet is to people now. But yeah, I do think about that, about how, moments like this or events like this are a opportunity to put a piece in conversation to sort of just say that like, that's where I was and this is where I am.
But haven't you largely chosen to have a media practice? I mean, with the writing, with your book series, and could we think of that practice as a way of leaving tracks, and that the tracks might lead somewhere if someone were to start following those tracks?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ideally the tracks lead to me and then people are like, why have you done this? So the media that I think is most, let's say, helpful to me, even though it takes me the longest to do, is the podcast, because it does leave this sort of tracks, but it is a conversational form. And at the same time, people can, I really appreciate it when people will leave me a question or sort of email the podcast and maybe leave a recording or something like this that I have to be in conversation with on the show, which is something that happened a couple of times last season and what I'm hoping will happen much more in the third season, because you have this, it's a place where I can open up to conversation or critique or comment from people coming from all over the place, not necessarily just within the institution. And that's an opportunity I really appreciate. Anyone who knows me can be like, oh, Jess will have you on the phone for like 3 hours without you realizing.
Well, I think it's very interesting to think about what you've been doing about cities in a podcast. And maybe to compare it to what Bryony has been doing in urban space with performance. And Bryony, maybe you can speak about what you think the differences in those practices are when you are engaging bodies in space, which in a certain way reconfigures that space, at least for the observer, versus the kinds of discussions that Jess has on our podcast about cities.
Yeah, and I think also connected to the way Deborah works with video. You know, it seems like we're all sort of trying to slip into these other mediums that can capture something that maybe the conventional traditions of drawing and analysis in architecture haven't been able to do. And I mean, for me, it is a medium that can get to the specificity of personal experience and physical bodily experience. That's what I love about performance. When it's individuals who are occupying the space, they're bringing all of their histories and their narratives, their experiences of the place. So it's really so much more than just a performance. It's also this sort of collision of individuals. And, you know, that is also a kind of political gesture, right? It's like asserting the importance of bodies in public space that are visible. Judith Butler writes about that really beautifully, that, you know, performance and protests are ways of asserting the importance, the vulnerability of bodily existence and how it needs to be, you know, recognized and supported by political institutions. So I think, but for me, it's both that sort of political aspect, but then also getting to the kind of messy strangeness of individual experience that I think is so hard to capture in the abstraction of many architectural tools.
If I can say something a little bit unrelated, but very related to what Deborah was saying. For those of us who fought for 40, 50 years to have women take more of a leadership role in architecture, I think we should all be very optimistic. I'm a big believer that schools and what you learn in school and the attitude and the culture that you get from school is very important. And I think it's a pretty interesting time that most of the, or many of the East Coast important schools of architecture, Pratt, Columbia, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, are all now led by women. Shouldn't we take some comfort and optimism from that?
I don't know about comfort. I would hate, I don't like the word comfort because it means it's like it's too easy, or okay, we've got there, so we can relax. Because I don't think we can relax. I don't think women can let their guard down, so to speak. I mean,
I'm not suggesting, I'm not suggesting, Cynthia, that anybody should let their guard down, women or men, because I think that everybody has an interest in having more people of talent take a leadership role. And I don't think it's a matter of men or women. I think it's people of talent. And the more you open something up to everybody, the more likely you are to get the best. So comfort was maybe the wrong word. I didn't mean, and it certainly hasn't been an easy road. I certainly agree with you about that, Cynthia. I didn't mean comfort. I just mean optimism.
I don't mean to jump on you, Paul, about using the word comfort, but as an editor, I can't help myself. I hear these words, and it's like when Deborah, when you were talking, and you know, you're using the word authority, and I keep asking myself, what does authority mean to Deborah? Doesn't she want to achieve some authority in her own work, in her own practice, in her teaching? What is authority? What do you think authority is today? And what does it, how does it relate to, how does authority relate to expertise, which I equate with training, with all that schooling you've had that you're now transmitting to your students and to your colleagues? What is authority today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, especially when we think about architecture, which I think borders on so many things beyond making buildings or whatever it is that we often think we do or go to school to learn. I think that, to me, and maybe I'll respond by going back to the main argument of the writing, which is that I think that there's a mythology of a transference of power in architecture that has been there for so long, which is the idea that power, or we could say respect, which might be a kind of version of authority, is passed down from mentor to mentee or employer to employee, or literally, you know, in some cases from a kind of established architect to a young architect. And so to me, I think when we dig into those particular histories, they've been male dominated. And I think it's a direct kind of, a directly connected concept to what you were speaking to, Cynthia, at the beginning, which is that the history of architecture has been written for so long by not women. And so, you know, those things aren't there for us to read into or to even, I think about as much. But I think that to me, that's one version of talking about what it means to transfer power, when in fact, that's a very basic way of understanding, we could say, power dynamics, or what it means to have power. And so I think that the term, literally, this is where the term, I think, daddy comes into play, is that there's so much historical baggage in architecture from those mythologies that we now have to carry on, be it the kind of racism of its history, be it the sort of politics of its history, to keep going in those understandings of lineage, or to keep, we could say, supporting a certain authority of architecture. We also support all of its kind of implications. And so what does it mean to use the history of architecture, to play with it, to take from it a kind of baseline, to say, this is really interesting, great. I have other kind of knowledge that maybe doesn't have to do with, you know, the way that history has been written by a so-called canon, but a kind of personal history, or be it a kind of history that has yet to be sort of spoken or written, right? To be able to take then the sort of, to take the control of writing that history is a flipping of power. I think the authority isn't given, but it's taken. It's a call for authority to sort of be actively owned, right? And so, I mean, one of the sort of main precedents for my thinking for this piece was someone like Lucy Ricardo. I love Lucy as both a pro of her trade, but someone who essentially takes the game and flips it for herself, but is like constantly at work because of that. And so I think maybe to also your point of like, there's no comfort, there's no resting point. I think maybe there's no resting point for now. I mean, that should be like, that should be a kind of like warning in itself. It's like, there's no rest for now. And that should like feel like a sort of a call, and a sort of, there's an urgency right now, I think, to take the reins of the mythologies and the narratives of architecture. I think it has to be done. I think certain things have to be called out, like, you know, the lineages of whatever, like Philip Johnson, are no longer okay, or no longer. So I think there's certain things that require an overtaking of a kind of narrative in a really active way. And so I think authority to me is maybe along the lines of what you were speaking to, which is who tells the story.
I think it's not only who tells the story, but who calls the shots. But, you know, I don't think, you know, we're looking at architecture kind of as a different thing than the rest of the world. And I don't think that it's any different. I don't think the place of women in architecture is any different than women in law, women in, certainly not women in elected politics at a very high level, although tonight we may see that change. So I don't think I think it's great though, Deborah, to see two of you speaking tonight who are co-alums in my class, in my MArch class. There were 7 of us, all men. There were no women there then, and now there are, and I think that that's great. I think that you're right, Cynthia, it's not comfort, but I guess I'm always just the optimist, and at least I see things by and large going in a good direction, a better direction, not great, but better. And also, by the way, you look at women-run firms, and quite frankly, Deborah, I think power is who runs the place. And you look at things that Deborah Burke's firm has done, or others like that. I think that is caused not for comfort, Cynthia. You're right. Comfort means that you put down your guard and you stop pushing. But I think that there's definitely room for, shall we say, optimism.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We have a question from Ashley Simone. Ashley, you want to turn on your microphone and ask your question?
Sure. It's more of a request, especially building on this idea of lineage and power that just came up between the conversation that Deborah had started and Paul continued. But Jessica had mentioned her beginning to think through ideas on lineage and kinship within architectural practice, and I was wondering if she could possibly expand on her ideas and how it relates to her work and thinking and her experience.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about this. I think it's kind of interesting, that diagram from that Deborah is bringing up, because, if I'm putting on also my labor organizing hat too, we see that diagram. It's like, oh my goodness, like, look at these father-son relations, as opposed to like, this is someone's boss and that is their worker, right? And then we romanticize the relationship to the point where it's like, oh, this isn't a labor exchange. It's like something, this like romantic apprenticeship or something like this, which I think is something that continues in architecture, and what makes the architecture sector like very ripe for a lot of labor exploitation. So when I think about like possible different forms of collective within architecture, like these alternative models of collective in architecture, I think the framework of kinship is really helpful, because it begins to give us a gateway beyond just, I have to work at the feet of a master, which is extremely like cancerously outdated, and start thinking about, how do I build lasting relationships where we both have stakes in the work moving forward in the long term. So like for me, I think about how, for example, I did a residency at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and someone who I was in that residency with, working shoulder to shoulder with in that residency, put me up for a residency in Stockholm, which is how I managed to do a season on Stockholm for my podcast. And now that I am at RISD, I have the ability to work again with people who, I was shoulder to shoulder with in that residency in Stockholm, and say, can you do an exhibition at RISD? And they can say, I can forward my work through this. And it's not as if I'm giving authority to them or they're giving authority to me. It's that we're giving opportunity to each other, because we have a similar, to go back to a term from my talk, we have a similar horizon line. And that's what's creating the collective, not this idea of verification or some sort of kind of blue check that's given to me by, to borrow Deborah's term, like some kind of, sugar daddy, that I'm seeing as my daddy rather than my boss, for whom, who is extracting, a certain amount of probably unpaid overtime hours from me, and being a little bit more, thoughtful and explicit about what the real relationships there are. And what everyone's getting out of those relationships.
Can I follow that up, Jess, just to keep kinship on the table for a minute? Is kinship also a way of recognizing the underrepresented?
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, when I was reading I reread your piece today. I didn't really find many redlining problems with it. I was pretty happy with it. And you talked about market exchange as being sort of the dominant thing in practice, and that that kinship that it thwarts peer-to-peer connection, which I relate to your idea of kinship, right? And that you said that we have to acknowledge relationship to each other as urgently as our relationship to the environment. So this is putting us in a different relationship to the environment, along the lines of Kim Tallbear that you talk about. But so is kinship recognizing the underrepresented? Is it recognizing the underrepresented participant in society, the under-recognized participant in architecture, the under-recognized participant, let's say, in the environment, meaning the environment itself as a participant? I mean, how broadly can we draw this? Because it would seem that we're all linked together. But then if we have this kind of unwieldy mass, can we get anything done? Where are there limits to kinship, I guess, would be a question.
Well, I think the term underrepresentation or underrepresented is an interesting one, because what it does is begin to describe a position or a perspective, right? So underrepresented to who? Like who is this underrepresented to? Or who, let's say, is not looking for this? Because often, you know, when we're talking about underrepresented communities, it's just like, from whose perspective are they underrepresented, right? From the perspective of like a power structure, or from the perspective of like the communities that they're working in, things like this. So when I think about what are the limits of kinship, I think that as it pertains to the closed system of the globe, there aren't really limits to kinship, because I think the thing that I mentioned in the piece is that whether you recognize the obligation or responsibility that you have along the lines of a kinship relation, you know, that obligation still exists. So whether or not we recognize what our right relation is with the earth is going to continue to do its thing. You know, the earth has always been the flexible organism in its environment, whether we're here or not, whether the ocean rises to our necks or not, it's going to keep going, right? It's going to adjust to whatever we throw into it, and be all right. It's us that has the problem, right? So when I think about, when I try to think about, you know, what is the opportunity that underrepresentation can do, that kinship can do for the underrepresented, what I actually begin to think about is, and you know, if any of my students are here, they will kill me because I'm constantly looking for a way to bring up Sylvia Wynter, is let's think instead of the overrepresented, right? And what is it that the overrepresented, or what is the frame that the overrepresented are forcing us to build solutions in, or what perspective is it forcing us to take that is actually nonsensical, or is actually a threat to our own survival? I think that is what kinship makes it possible to begin to see.
That's a great point. Bryony, and I know Meredith, you have a question, but let me just throw this to Bryony. Bryony, when you hear Jess talk about kinship, or when you read her piece and were working on it for long, are there any resonances between her concept of, or the way she's presenting kinship, and what you're talking about with intersectionality?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, and I'm sure Jess would have a lot to say on that as well. I think it's also, this idea of kinship is also really connected to ideas of radical care, and the idea of, you know, positing care as an ethic for being in the world more than exploitation or extraction. I think those are pretty parallel to Jess's contrast between a kind of market logic versus kinship. And I think real care and kinship come from acknowledging the sort of full spectrum of someone's experience and the ways in which they are living in different systems of oppression, and the way that they sort of compound each other, and creating actual changes in those conditions require looking at sort of all of the different systems that are perpetuating those oppressions. And so I think it's inherently a kind of, well, as I said before, like a kind of personal task of understanding personal experience, but also a kind of long-running campaign in terms of thinking about systemic change. So, I mean, to kind of tie it back to the debate that was just happening about, you know, having women in leadership positions, I think that is a question of like representation, right, which is important, but I think there's so many other dimensions that are just as important that can't be addressed solely by having a woman in a position of power. That doesn't guarantee that there is a structure of care or of kinship for all the other people who are, you know, under her in an institution, or that institution is itself serving and supporting communities outside of it, right? So that takes a real shift in a kind of ethical position and a sense of really the metrics for measuring action. I think that's part of what Jess is talking about too, right? This question of value. How do you value decisions that are made? And, you know, the market economy gives us one metric for value, but I think a lot of what's being said tonight is about how can we posit other value systems, and saying also that that's not so, it's a radical reconception of living on this planet, but it's not an impossibility. And I think the more people, as Jess said, set that as a horizon, and we see that, I think, well, certainly in social movements, but also with the kind of visibility of policies that start to consider, you know, universal healthcare and things like that, that just setting the ambition starts to make them more of a reality. And I see that in architecture practice too, that I think the more people are forming practices with these goals, the more it is becoming feasible and viable and financially sustainable and not so ridiculous, but actually kind of graspable.
Meredith, did you want to ask your question? We're close to running out of time. I should see if there's a chat question too.
Yeah, if any students or guests have questions, please take them first.
Well, the warning is to the students, this is your next to last chance to pose a question or to say you want to ask a question. And while we wait to see if any arise, Meredith, why don't you go ahead and ask yours?
Okay, well, actually the one I had in mind was about care. So Bryony, in a way you answered this, but I did see that as a concept that connected all three of your works and in different ways. Deborah, in terms of mentorship and you know, the care that somebody who's not acting like a daddy might give, and Jess, also in terms of your practice with the architecture lobby, that in a sense, you know, that's a structure that's asking us to perform a certain kind of care for one another, and in fact a very old structure, but just one that we haven't had within architecture yet. So I was just interested to hear maybe some of your thoughts about whether that term seems like a useful one in your thinking, or whether your practice is also leading us in other directions beyond care. So you guys kind of answered that a little bit already, but if you have any more thoughts, I'd be happy to hear them.
Deborah, do you want to try to take that? Because I don't know that you've talked about care or.
Sure. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about this word care, and I think that for me specifically, I think a lot of the questions of lineage and mentorship are maybe more specific to the writing of that diagram of that, right? So really to history, or to a history written through mentorship. And I think that for me, and maybe, you know, again, it goes back to this question of like leadership, or the idea that, you know, leadership is one that's often is the part of the system that's written into history more often than a lot of the other things that happen in life on a daily basis. Like the fact that history is sort of removed from a reality, we could say, and maybe that's a question of scale or whatever, but I think that for me, there's a sort of I'm interested in the idea of there's some things that need to be taken care of, meaning history needs to be taken care of. You know, the idea that the kind of writing of history or the way that we choose to write history needs to be sort of taken care of. To me, I'm more interested in questions of how do we change the pieces of architecture that are already established. So I mean, I sort of mentioned Philip Johnson, but I think there's a lot of parts of architectural history that maybe we don't really want to examine or talk about. And so there seems to be a kind of initial questioning of history that is already happening. I mean, I only bring these things up because they're already happening in the world. Like, you know, Mitch McEwen's sort of reference to a lot of writers and thinkers that are already sort of taking a stance on, wait a second, like, what is this stuff that we've been looking at for so long in architecture? And that first investigation is one that should be, I think, taken on with a lot of power. And so to me, I mean, maybe that's where the idea of care comes into the stuff that I'm writing about in relation to history. But I mean, I 100% think that in terms of the way that we operate architecture, the way that we hope to operate architecture, certain modes of exchange no longer make sense. Because these narratives they're not romantic, to use Jess's term again. They're not romantic to so many people in architecture. Like, not only are they not romantic, they just don't make sense, and they're not worth investing the self into. And so I think that maybe that goes into the idea of like self-care, of being really of taking control of where one puts their efforts and puts their energy, right? And so I think maybe that's where there's a kind of overlap in the conversation that I'm sort of putting on the table. But I think there's definitely a conversation on care that maybe begins from a kind of place of the self and of how one chooses to sort of take on the things that are so often just, I think, absorbed part of architecture when they really don't have to, and maybe sometimes shouldn't be.
Yeah, I also want to respond to that, hopefully quickly and briefly. I think that care is a very abused term. And like, to go back to, and I know that you weren't using it this way, Deborah, but like, self-care I find to be like an incredibly abusive term, because what it's allowed it to do is essentially take the practice function of care and make it a market exchange, right? Care is something that you can purchase. It's something that, you know, you put on a fuzzy robe and that's self-care. Like, you get like an hour lunch break that you're already supposed to have, and that's self-care, things like this. But it's like, if you bring care into a collective understanding, then we can begin to sort of get somewhere, because we're building a little bit more power, building a little bit more structure. You know, when I think about unionization, right, I think that is a form of care in labor, and bringing that into the architectural sector, I think, will be crucial in terms of building any kind of power or voice in the architectural sector, to then relate back to the public. Like, one thing that I ask participants who are new to the architecture lobby, who are maybe coming to a chapter meeting for the first time, is if you go to just any stranger on the street and you ask them, you know, what would you need a lawyer for? They can tell you. What do you need a doctor for? They can tell you. What do you need an architect for? I don't have the money, right? Like, why would I need an architect, right? So it's like, sometimes when we get started on the sort of labor conversation in architecture, it's about like, how can we get paid like other professions, and not so much how can we matter to society like other professions, right? And it's not just about like, oh, you know, how do we get recognized? Like, how will people understand that I have a Pritzker and that's important? And yeah. Rather than how can we expand what architectural work is to the point that it is relevant socially, right? Is a different question. And that, to me, speaks of care.
Can I jump on sort of tangentially on that? I think, you know, to that question before also, and what you just brought up, Jess, about, you know, how is architecture different? Like, I think a lot of these questions of you know, what care and what organizing can do are somewhat parallel to other professions, but I think it's also interesting in the work that both of you do to think about how kind of like hacking the mediums of architecture produces openings for kinship and care, like informal ways, you know, in sort of mediated ways. So I noticed both of you really, you know, you create these mediums that are very fluid, right? And kind of, Jess, you talked about dialogue and the ability to have a dialogue with strangers, and that being as a way to posit ideas. And Deborah, I think the way you make these videos where they are, I mean, their rhythm, their music, they're open-ended to the kind of worlds of other people that get folded into something. I feel like in terms of architecture, it's important for us to ask, like, how do we make things differently so that they can enable care? And I feel like those were examples of like structures that are open to collaborators coming in, to the contributions of others, you know, they are themselves like support structures for other people's experiences. And I think that's important to think about in terms of how we can keep doing things like that.
We haven't gotten any more questions. Do you have any questions for each other? Or Meredith, should we, or any challenges? Meredith, should we call it dinner time?
I think we can call it dinner time unless anyone has any last points. I appreciated what Ariane Harrison said in the chat, that if expanding modes of practice point to a present effort and future inclusivity and broadening of the field, that there is equally a necessary effort in remediating the archive of women's sustained contributions to architecture, and that Federica might be positioned to describe the important archiving process underway at Pratt, which actually might be a kind of just nice way to bring it back institutionally to some of the things Deborah was saying, that because I really did think that there was this sort of strong role for historians to play too in trying to find ways to write about what had, when I was a student, was called always minor practices. People would say, oh, you're writing about a minor practice. And I would think, no, this is that, you know, I'm writing about practices that sustain life. So I think if we shift some of the ways in which we narrate architectural history, we have that potential. And there is a very exciting project underway at Pratt happening, if you want to say a word about that, Federica.
Well, yes, it's about this system of value that was mentioned a few times here. So if the practice of architecture becomes truly inclusive, so what are these systems of values that for which this is architecture, this is not architecture, or what architecture should be? And perhaps also Harriet wants to talk about the project that actually is interesting everybody in this moment, and tomorrow is gonna go out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that we're over time, and I just wanted to say very quickly that yes, at Pratt, since I arrived anyway, we began a mistresses project looking at mistresses, taking the 19th century meaning of mistress, which is rather than a woman of low morals, which is how the term has been misappropriated, obviously by men serving a particular gender. Mistress actually used to mean a woman of substantial means, somebody who had financial independence from men, or was an expert in their field, an educator, or had a public life. So we've reappropriated the term back to mean somebody who, much like a master of architecture, is a leader within the discipline. And we've arranged a series of events and actually, well, tomorrow morning, but yes, up until today, we're frantically co-authoring an National Archive grant to look at really pushing the boundaries of what it takes to, what constitutes the materiality of the canon. Because if you look through history, it's not only that men were exclusively privileging the outputs, they were defining what a privileged output is. And in doing that, they limited the materiality, the processes, and focused principally on product-driven outcomes, which were about major commissions and monographs, rather than, I would say, the more rarefied practices that women more often, not by choice, found themselves active in doing due to the discrimination that prevails in architecture. So I just want to conclude by coming back to and not to punish the innocent comment about comfort, but, you know, precarity, I've put some things in the chat coming back to this signaling of women being brought in. Often we call it actually the glass cliff face, and the glass cliff face refers to bringing women into failing institutions or failing contexts, whether it's higher education or law or politics. It's how Iceland's banking system was recovered incredibly quickly, is because they fired all the guys and brought in a bunch of women, right? So it's interesting that often when women are brought in, the level, the risk factors, the pressure and the extraordinary, and often, I would say in the case of how Ava's been treated at the AA, far more, I would say, violently, truthfully, than a man who had committed similar, issues, if you like, would have been treated. And also, if you've not read Leslie Loco's account of why she's stepped down after literally only 8 months as a dean at CUNY, then you really should. And it's a fascinating, I think, imprint of some of the systemic failures of institutions to support women of diversity taking on roles of leadership. So I think that it's, comfort is one thing, but I think that it's actually the precarity that most women leaders are facing right now. We've seen it across the heritage sector, particularly across the cultural sector. If you looked at how people are treated, such as the director of Cooper Hewitt, among others, various collections across Europe, these kind of women who are brought in very, very easily disposed of, when either through under the ruse in many ways of financial agendas. I think that we have a lot of work to do to assume that a handful of us, even whether it's, unfortunately New York State is not the canary in the mine for the rest of the world as a signaler of equality. I think we need to start to recognize that these minority positions that women occupy in kind of hierarchical institutions do not make it okay for the majority of our faculty to be underpaid or employed through precarious means or on part-time fragile contacts. And if you look at actually where many women are situated, and also where many BIPOC employees are situated, it's often in the more precarious roles within any faculty. So I just want to kind of say that as much as I would love to feel comforted right now by the current configuration of New York as one sample of representation, it's not, by no means is it an assurance that we have achieved the progress we need in order to address many of the ongoing inequality issues facing architectural education as both a reflector and director of practice. So not that I want to end on a dystopian note, but I will hand over to Meredith now, after issuing my thanks to all of the speakers and the wonderful chairing of Cynthia, for Meredith, who convened this fabulous event this evening, to have the final word. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Harriet. I think that, that's such a powerful comment and a reminder for us. And I feel really torn right now between the optimism and excitement that I hear from all three of the discussions today, and knowing your practice and knowing the ways that the three of you are really forcing open all kinds of spaces in practice and in academia. Just fills me with excitement, and I kind of can't wait for that horizon, Jess. It's just sort of thrilling to feel that a movement towards that, and at the same time to confront all the blockades that are going up against that movement. I think we also have to do quite with very clear eyes. So I hope that in wrapping up tonight, we can kind of take both our energy and enthusiasm and the feeling of necessity for really of transformation forward with us as perhaps a form of comfort, and use all these exciting presentations and inspiring presentations as a way to keep us all moving forward. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for your incredible moderating. Your questions are brilliant as always, and I feel very lucky to have you here too. Thanks to everyone for coming and being part of this discussion. And thank you so much, Federica, for being the co-organizer of the lecture series with me this year. Thanks. We can all have a drink now. I'll turn off the recording.
Thank you.
Thank you.